Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants. Good morning or good day to all of you, wherever you may be. Allow me to welcome you to today's webinar, which is titled How to Navigate the Legal Framework and IPR Protection in Vietnam's Growing Food Industry. Because of the ongoing trade war between the US and China, Vietnam is at the moment a very interesting location for foreign investors. But due to a population that is going to surpass 100 million people soon and a rising middle class that wants to consume like we do in the West, the country is also becoming an interesting market option for Western products. This means that traditional Western food products like wine or cheese, for example, are becoming more and more popular, and an interesting market is forming. This is reason enough for us to look at the possibilities the Vietnamese food industry is offering. My name is Daniel Marek, and I'm one of the two regional managers for ASEAN at the OAV, the German Asia Pacific Business Association, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's webinar. Please allow me to say some words about the OAV. The OAV is one of the largest German foreign trade associations with around 500 corporate members and functions as a platform for exchanging knowledge and experiences across different industries, all with a focus on the thriving Asia-Pacific region. As a powerful network of companies with strong institutional connections, we work closely together with ministries, authorities, and embassies across the Asia-Pacific region, or as today with our knowledgeable network partners. Hence, I'm very glad to welcome Dr. Jörg Michael Scheil, Partner and Chief Representative of the German law firm Schulz Noah Querwinkel, who is a legal expert on China and Vietnam with a focus on the food industry. Dr. Scheil is joining us from Shanghai today. And as our second speaker, I want to welcome Ms. Nora Bihari, who is a project manager at the Southeast Asia IPR SME Help Desk, a project funded by the European Union with the task to help European companies with intellectual property rights issues when entering the Southeast Asian markets. Mrs. Bihari is based in Ho Chi Minh City, so welcome the two of you, and we are looking forward to what you are going to present in a few minutes. But before diving into the topic itself, I would like to point out one project that OAV has in stock regarding Vietnam. We are organizing a delegation trip to Vietnam from 19th to 26th of November this year, and if you're interested in this booming economy, you can join us. The focus of our mission will be somewhat different from the standard delegation trips that you might know, because we want to get in touch with Vietnamese companies like the Vin Group with its first Vietnamese car-producing company, VinFast, or Vinamilk, among others. Because those are the companies that can help you when you want to enter the Vietnamese market. Of course, we will also put some parts of our delegation trip on the usual stuff, like meeting German companies in the country and getting in touch with local authorities. If you're interested, you can find more information on the delegation trip on our website, www.oav.de. Lastly, let me point out some of the technical details of this webinar. During the webinar, you can open the options through the control panel by clicking on the orange arrow, which is here. You can enter questions during the webinar here. There's a box called questions or Fragen, depending on the language version you have chosen for the webinar, where you can just key in your question and will be displayed here. And after our two presentations, we will have some time left to answer the questions. If the number of questions is too much and we cannot answer all of them within the 1 hour time frame that you have set us, then these questions can be answered later on via email with our speakers. So please just key in your questions if you have something. All the questions will be collected by me, and please note that you as participants are muted for the webinar in order to keep things quiet, so that there's just the option typing in your question. Okay, so I think that's it for the technical details. If anything comes up, you can also use the question box to do any questions in regard to technical issues, and we will try to solve these within the time. But now, without much further ado, I will give the word to our first speaker, Dr. Scheil. As discussed, we will start with you. So the stage is yours. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marek, and good afternoon to all of you who are in Asia, and good morning to all our European participants. It's my pleasure to share with you today some first overview and first insights into the legal framework of exporting food products to the Vietnamese market. So food law can sometimes be a very dull and technical field, but I will try my best to not confuse you and instead to explain some basic structures to you. So actually, of course, there are many business models which could be used when as a food manufacturer, as a trader, maybe also as a probably food equipment manufacturer, you could apply in Vietnam. For example, you could just simply export European food products which you manufacture in Europe to the Vietnamese market, and this will be our main focus today. When you do so, you can do this from offshore, from a company in Europe, but you can also support this export business by having some organization in Vietnam, for example, a representative office or even a wholly owned subsidiary to help you to import and distribute your product into the market, and probably also to provide some supplementary services. You can also work in the other direction. You could source food products from Vietnam and export those products to the EU. Also, this is basically generally legally feasible. And once again, also these kind of sourcing activities can be supported by a rep office or a company which you may establish in Vietnam. And potentially, of course, you can also go into manufacturing. You could establish food manufacturing or food processing in Vietnam in form of your own 100% company, or possibly in a joint venture with a Vietnamese partner. Only certain product lines, which you see mentioned here on the slides, are not available for such investments, but the others are. But as I said before, our main focus today will be the regulatory framework when you export EU food products into Vietnam. And here, let us look at some basics. So basically, as a principle, food can be freely imported into Vietnam and traded nationwide. However, conditions are the food needs to conform to Vietnamese technical regulations. In other words, to food standards, food safety standards. You need some registration procedures, and you need to go through some regulatory inspections. And for certain food items, special food products, such as functional food, I will talk about this term later, micronutrient fortified food, GMO, and irradiated food, you will also need certain additional certificates, like a certificate of free sale or health certificate from your home country. And you have to provide and show these certificates to the Vietnamese authorities. So, as I said before, in Vietnam, standards are normally called technical regulations. Vietnam has already enacted a great number of food standards for different products, and when you bring the products into the market, you have to declare that your products are in line with these technical regulations. Since 2018, and a decree which was issued in that year, the import process has been simplified somehow. And self-announcement applies for most products, mainly prepackaged food. Whereas for some other food items, special food, functional food, the requirement is a bit more formalized. You need to do a so-called registration of announcement. So what this means is basically self-announcement. You publish by yourself on some mass media, on your website, or even in form of a hangout in your premises, that your food conforms to the regulations. This will be sent to the authorities, and then you can sell your product. If you have to do the registration of announcement, you have to provide some more materials, and these materials need to be sent to the food safety authorities. They will process them, and after 2 or 3 weeks, an announcement will be published by the authorities, and then your products are good to go. If anything changes, the composition of your food product changes, you will have to go through the basic procedure again. And then there is food safety inspection. So imported food may go through regulatory inspection. There are 3 levels, as you can see here: common inspection, tightened inspection, or simplified inspection. Okay, so for all of those of you who are in the business of exporting food to other countries, you know that food labeling, food information law is always one area to watch very closely. So just today, some basic principles of how to do food labeling in Vietnam. So all imported food must bear labels, of course, except raw food, etc. But basically, we are talking here about prepackaged food. And there are certain compulsory items that need to be on a label. Those compulsory items must be available in Vietnamese. That obviously means someone has to translate it into Vietnamese. Maybe you will let your importer do that, but my advice would always be know what is going on. Be sure that everything is correctly translated and that the label is proper. Otherwise, there can be all kinds of trouble. So here we have a look at the basic information which a food label for imported products in Vietnam must show. Of course, product name, ingredients. Here, production date, of course, shelf life, how long can consumers use the product, usage instructions, etc. Where does it come from? And here you have to refer also to the registration which you have done in step 1. to show that your product has been properly registered. And if necessary, any advisory statements, warnings, which consumers should pay attention to. Then in addition to this mandatory content, which always needs to be there on each label, there are some general principles. These principles are not very different from what you know in EU food law or in other countries. Of course, confusion must be avoided. You cannot mislead consumers with your labels. You cannot make any deceptive declarations regarding any features or properties of the food product. You should not confuse your product, let's say, with another product. You should not include wrong or misleading references so that consumers will mistake your product for another one. The label must be durable. And sensitive content or information, political content, etc., should be avoided. Here you see a reference to some pieces of legislation where you can find more details about these labeling requirements. So I already mentioned functional food before, and as also in the EU and other markets, functional food comes with some additional requirements also as to labeling. Here you see 4 important categories of functional food, and you see how they are understood and defined in Vietnam. And I think you are familiar with these categories. Food for special and medical purposes becoming more and more important. This is food which will be used, which will be applied by health workers or professionals, but also food supplements, something like vitamins people want to take in to stay healthy, to support certain functions of the body. But also food for old people, for special dietary requirements. All these kind of things are also regulated in Vietnam. The definitions are fairly similar to international standards, so no big surprises here. Okay. When you want to import a product, you would also like to do advertising for it. And generally, if your food is allowed for sale in Vietnam, it can also be freely advertised. However, if you are the foreign manufacturer and you have no establishment in Vietnam, as mentioned at the beginning, your own rep office, your own company in Vietnam, the ad has to be placed through a Vietnamese advertising agency. The agency can also help you with how to do this, and so on and so on. They can also actually help you to avoid certain sensitive content or content which will not be, let's say, received well by Vietnamese consumers. And this kind of screening, of course, obviously should be done before you launch a campaign. Do only advertise those products which have been properly registered. Then, of course, the content of advertisement must be accurate. It cannot be deceptive or misleading. All those items here must be truthfully stated in advertisement. And be careful with comparative or superlative announcements as saying our product is the #1, is the best, is better than this and that. Same as in other countries, the Vietnamese law does not really support those kind of phrases or statements. And there can be, the authorities could take up such issues. So very important when it comes to functional food and breast milk substitutes for infants. When you advertise, you cannot create in any way an impression that these products are medicine. So the line to medicine must always be very clearly drawn. And so there is a special statement which must be expressed. Here you see it in Vietnamese. And in English, it's basically to say this product is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease. Yeah, so that it cannot be confused with drugs or medicine, because those products are separate, are subject to separate legal rules and procedures for their import and distribution in the country. And you can also not indirectly imply that this is somehow a pharmaceutical or something by, for example, showing a doctor on the packaging. This will also not be appreciated very much. Right. Beverages, of course, are one important category of food items. And here you should probably know and remember that there is a tightened legal framework for alcoholic drinks. In terms of the import and also the retailing, how alcoholic drinks can be sold to consumers and where actually they can be sold and consumed. Special licenses will be required for every one who wants to trade alcohol inside of Vietnam. But good news, beer and everything that contains less than 5% alcohol is exempted from the special regulations on alcoholic drinks. Excuse me. So let's look at some of the administrative practices. How do the Vietnamese authorities look at food safety? Which authorities are actually involved? And which are some things you should, let's say, pay attention to? So here, unfortunately, it's getting a little bit complicated. As in other areas in Vietnam, I don't know exactly why, several ministries and other authorities are involved and have some competence in the field of food safety for different food items. And sometimes it seems that jurisdictions are overlapping. So Ministry of Health is very important, but the other two ministries are also involved here in food safety. The local people's committees execute management of food safety in their areas. Then a special government department called STAMEC is basically in charge for the correctness of labels. It's under the Ministry of Science and Technology. And then very important, most important, the VFA, Vietnam Food Administration. It belongs to the Ministry of Health. It's entrusted with the general management of food safety in Vietnam, both in manufacturing and circulation phase. And on top of all that, there's also the Department of Science and Technology and the Market Surveillance Authority, which are in charge of certain special items. Like here you have the beverages again, the liquor, but also processed milk and vegetable oil, which obviously is quite considered quite important because people use it for cooking and so on. Okay. So hopefully after this webinar today, you already have a good sense of how to make sure to comply with all the requirements. But it's probably also good to know what could happen in case that your products are challenged by the authorities or by consumers. So what kind of sanctions could apply for violations of food law, substandard products, and so on. Sanctions can basically be normally an administrative fine. There can be recall. You can be asked to destroy questionable food. And there could also be civil lawsuits initiated by consumers. We will talk a little bit about the legal principles involved here in another slide. Normally, how the authorities will quantify fines. There are tables attached to some of the regulations, and so it depends on the scale of the business, your illegal profits, and it can, for example, typically a fine can be up to 4 to 5 times the amount of the illegally gained profits. So it could add up to substantial amounts. Right. So I think every consumer article producer is obviously concerned of a recall. This is what we never want to happen. If there is such a case, we need a crisis team and we need to react very quickly. So when are recalls required? I give you all the items here first. It's basically quite common sense. Food is expired. It does not conform to the safety standards. So these are the main instances. In case of a defective product and when you have to initiate a recall, both the manufacturer and the trader will have to cooperate very well. Both will be subject to some legal obligations and responsibilities. The trader will normally, of course, be an organization in Vietnam, so the authorities will probably first look at the trader and first question the trader, and very often it will be a situation where the trader will then try to take recourse to the manufacturer because obviously the trader doesn't want to bear all the costs by himself. And there is a special circular where recall activities are defined in more detail. In addition to that, and in addition to being fined by the authorities, hopefully never, there can also be a civil law side. Consumers could bring a lawsuit to a Vietnamese court in connection with a food product. It could be a case of tort liability, of compensation for damages, or it can be a consumer protection lawsuit. Tort liability is a liability which can hit the trader and also the manufacturer when the rights of consumers are infringed, typically when there is a health impairment. It's regulated in the Civil Code of Vietnam. There may be some exemptions, of course, which then you have to prove. Liability for compensation of damages. depending on the actual circumstances. And there is also something like consumer rights protection lawsuits. So there are social organizations in Vietnam which have the right to bring food-related lawsuits to the courts on behalf of consumers. Until now, it is not, from what I have seen, not very often. It doesn't happen very often in Vietnam, but the framework exists, and I think you should be aware of it. Right. So at the end, please allow me to say a very few words about what we mainly do in this field in Vietnam, and what the kind of practical outlook here is, and also how we can support European or Asian food exporters. So we provide market entry advice. If you want to expand your business in Vietnam by setting up a distribution company, or maybe first step a representative office, we can do that for you. We can advise you in all respects to that. Then, of course, we do regulatory advice on food products. We can advise you about the import procedures, about the labeling, about any other aspects. But it doesn't stop there. Then also you need contractual. You have the contractual side. You may cooperate with a Vietnamese importer, with a distributor. You may have sales contracts that need to be reviewed. You may need contracts in a Vietnamese version, etc. And then, and this is maybe leading over to Nora's part in a way, of course, we can also support you when you want to protect your trademarks under which your food products are sold in the market, or even in case where your trademarks are infringed. And if there should ever be a case where you face a consumer complaint, or even a recall, or where your advertisement is challenged by the authorities, we can also step in and represent you, defend you, and advise you on your legal options to stay safe and get out of such a difficult situation as well. Well, thank you very much. This brings me to the end of my presentation, and you have here our contact information where you can find us. So of course, we would be glad to keep in dialogue with you and support you on other questions, on all questions that may come up. Thanks a lot for now.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation, Dr. Scheil. Before we switch over to Ms. Bihari, just some small remarks from my side. We have already gathered a bunch of questions that also for you two speakers you can see in the panel already. If you want to have a first look. As I mentioned before, questions will be answered after both presentations. Maybe the standard question that already has come up here 3 times, I think, is if both presentations would be available after the webinar. So we will discuss this with the speakers and tell you the answer later in the Q&A, but I assume that this might be possible. Okay, thank you. Then now we will switch over to Ms. Bihari, who's going to introduce her work in Vietnam in regards to IPR protection. Okay. Okay, yeah, we have the presentation then.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Marek. And I also would like to thank you for Dr. Schell for this very insightful presentation, which already gave a good basis, I think, for the second session where I would like to discuss with you on the importance of intellectual property rights protection. But before we start with that, let me welcome the audience, all of you who are joining this interesting webinar today from Europe and also from Southeast Asia. Before understanding about intellectual property rights, let me introduce you to the Southeast Asia IPR SME Helpdesk Project services. This project is an initiative of the European Commission to help small and medium-sized enterprises in Europe to protect and enforce their intellectual property rights in or relation to Southeast Asia. We provide free of charge advice on IP. The advice that we provide is always first-line advice, jargon-free, and business-focused. It's important to understand that we are not acting as a legal firm. It's more on a consultation level to allow companies to get a good understanding why and how to take actions related to IP. On the slide, you can see the services that we offer. So you can get in touch with us through our inquiry helpline via phone, email, and you will receive an answer within 3 working days. If you happen to be in Vietnam, feel free to book a consultation with us in person. We also have various publications available on our website for download on different IP topics, and also country fact sheets about all the 10 ASEAN countries, which can be interesting for you as well to check. We also offer on-site and online trainings. So online trainings can be the one that we do today in webinar format. We do that regularly, basically 1 session per month. So if you follow us on social media or you check our events calendar, you can know more about the upcoming sessions. And we do on-site trainings across Europe and Southeast Asia as well. We also have interactive tools. So for example, in the format of e-learning modules where you can learn about IP in a, let's say, a more fun way. You have a quiz session in the module, so you can also test your knowledge. So now let's dive into the presentation and let's have a good understanding what intellectual property rights mean. We differentiate between different IP types. So this slide will just give you a very brief overview what kind of IP rights we can talk about. So first of all, copyrights, which usually protect software, but also particularly artistic elements in creations. Copyright is an automatic right that arises at the moment when a work is created. Even though we still recommend you to register it, because in case of any problem, you can enforce your rights if they were registered before. Then we can also talk about patents, which is considered to be a product or a process that provides in general a new way of doing something, and it always has to be related to invention. And what can be considered an invention? An invention has to be new, not obvious, and needs to have an industrial application. I also would like to highlight that having a patent in Europe for more than 1 year, it cannot be registered as a patent, for example, in Southeast Asia, since it's novelty. Then we can also discuss about industrial design, which protects the appearance of a product. It also has to be new, creative, and with an industrial application. Usually, design prioritizes registration according to the product of the country. Then one of the most important IP type that I assume that is the most relevant to all of you who are attending the webinar today is trademark, which is a sign that identifies and distinguishes in the marketplace the products of one enterprise from those of other enterprises. Trademark helps you to build relationship with the client. It gives you reputation. So it's something that you want to protect and make sure that you don't have any problem with it. And also, as you are food and beverage companies, I would like to mention about geographical indication that we usually just call as GI, which is a sign, usually the name of a territory, and used to identify goods that come from the specific geographical place and possess qualities, characteristics, or reputation that are due to that origin. GI protects food and beverage. However, in Southeast Asia, it also protects locally produced handicraft products. And you must know that it does not give you the sole right to use it. Any producers that compiles with the criteria has the right to use the specific GI. So now let's see about trademark registration in Vietnam. So I would like to clarify that if you have your trademark registered in Europe, and I assume that most of you have it registered in Europe, is not valid in Vietnam. When you come to Vietnam, if you want to make sure that your trademark is registered, you have to register it locally. IP rights are territorial, and it's not immediate. When you file your application, it will take you 15 months to receive your registration. And you also need to keep in mind that the cost for a trademark registration is not very high. It's 54 euros in Vietnam. The cost is different in other Southeast Asian countries, but basically similar to that one. And this only means the cost of the registration. After, you need to pay some additional fee for the agency who will register your trademark or the legal office. And your trademark registration lasts 10 years, and then you need to renew. Design protection. So similar to trademark, it will take you 15 months to register. The cost is as well similar. The duration is a bit different. It will last 5 years and renewable up to 15 years. GI protection is 12 months that you can register it. The cost is higher and lasts continuously without the need to renew. So that's a big difference. So I understand that all of you will be attending a trade fair in Vietnam in November. And I just would like to discuss with you that, of course, trade fairs are a great opportunity to exhibit the product, explore opportunities in Vietnam, meet potential clients. Hopefully you will come back with great follow-up leads or even conduct business deals. However, you should be aware of that it's also a moment when you will be disclosing your product, your innovation. You will be using your logo and your trademark. And for example, in that case, you can be also victim of trademark squatting, which means that someone before you will register your right. So it's very important to be aware of that. Of course, you cannot register your trademark in every single country where you do business if you are present in all the countries of the world, but it's good to consider IP as an integral part of your business strategy and make sure that if you think that it's important for you, you take action on time. Play smart. What do we mean under that? So once you come to Southeast Asia, identify which IP asset is the priority for you. Is it your brand name? You want to enter into licensing agreements? You have an invention that you want to protect. Always sign non-disclosure agreements with your local partner. So even you come for a trade fair, if you start doing, you start entering into a negotiation with the client, and NDA is very important. And I also would like to highlight that it's important that you translate it into the local language. In case of any issue in the future, it helps you to enforce your rights. And monitor the market for possible infringements, which mean that register on time and make sure that no one has registered your brand before you. But in case any problem comes up and you need to go for enforcement, what you need to know. First, you need to own that right, which means that the right needs to be registered. If your right has not been registered, there is no way that you can enforce it. In Southeast Asia, you need to perform your own investigation and collect all the evidences, which helps you to prove that you are owning that right. And I'm sorry. And all the documents have to be legalized, notarized, and translated into the local language. And before taking actions, you also need to ask for, well, it's a recommendation to ask an advice from an independent agency. And when it comes to enforcement, yes, Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, there are possibilities to enforce. The legal framework is already quite developed. However, the key issues that are still to be improved are usually related to enforcement. However, I would like to give you a very brief overview about the avenues for enforcement. One of the options can be administrative action. So administrative action is not available in all the Southeast Asian countries, but it's available in Vietnam. So this is a good news for you. It's quite cost effective and quick. That's also good. However, for long established infringer, it's not really suitable because basically they have the tendency not to take seriously any notices received for administrative offices only from law enforcement. Therefore, it's difficult to stop the action. Usually, it can be administrative action for smaller infringers can be suitable to stop the action. However, you would not regain the damages. Another option can be the civil action, which may bring you better aspects in the sense that you can receive an injunction and stop the action and also be compensated. However, it's quite costly at civil action, and also it often happens that the damage is not high enough to start the action, especially in the case of SMEs, and also it's quite time consuming and burdensome since you have to collect all the documents and evidences yourself. The last resort option is criminal prosecution, which is usually used for copyright infringement and trademark counterfeiting. But it also requires a lot of preparation from the legal assistance and coordination with the law enforcement, and you will not regain the damages, only penalty and imprisonment might be prescribed. A fourth option, which we often mention to SMEs, these are the alternative dispute resolution. So, for example, in the case of a cease and desist letter, which is written by the local lawyer, you can stop the infringement, and it's a bit less informal, but it can be quite effective to stop the action. In case your business partner abuse your IP rights, but you still want to keep the relationship with this business partner, then you can enter into a negotiation and mediation and try to find a solution for both parties. And the third option can be arbitrations, which is a little bit more complex because you have to involve a third party, and this can be more time consuming and also more costly, and it's kind of similar to the civil action. However, it's quite transparent and faster than the traditional court, so it can also be an option. We usually suggest this option when an infringing product is being distributed in several countries, and it makes it possible that you have the arbitration with the principal licensor. So I think that's all I wanted to mention to you today, just to give you a very brief overview. And later during the Q&A session, feel free to ask any further questions. And I mean, there is a lot of things to clarify in terms of IP protection. So I would recommend you to get in touch with the help desk, and we are very happy to provide any further information. Just to give you some example, we can provide you with NDA template. We can explain you about we can give you step-to-step advice how to register the trademark in the different Southeast Asian countries. We can give you advice about how to include, like for example, in the case of trade secret, how to include it in a non-disclosure agreement, or review your IP clause in the contract. So we hope that any of our advice might be useful for you. Thank you very much, and I give the micro back to Mr. Marek.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Bihari, for your presentation. I do think that all the participants now have a clearer picture on the services you're offering in regards to IPR protection. And yeah, let me take back the screen. Okay. And yeah, now we will come to the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left. So if you do have some questions, please key them in now. We have gathered some questions already. Just a small clarification. Ms. Bihari mentioned that there will be a food-related trade fair in Vietnam, which is the Vietnam Food Expo, going to take place in mid-November, basically just the week before we are planning to be in Vietnam. Our delegation, as I mentioned, will be from the 19th to 26th. So it might be to some of you interesting to first join the trade fair in Vietnam and then directly proceed with our delegation. So if Vietnam is an interesting country to you and your company, this might be a very viable option to spend about 2 weeks in the country. Okay, now let's go on and get to the Q&A. I see that we have about 10 minutes left. Yeah, I mentioned one question that came up, which is maybe the standard question for such occasions. Will it be possible to have both of your presentations after the webinar as a copy? Maybe as a first question. I see Dr. Scheil is nodding. How about you, Ms. Bihari?
Yes, of course it's possible. I would send it to you in PDF version. And I wanted to mention that we have one guide on food and beverage industry, so IP considerations in the food and beverage industry. So I think that it could be very useful to share it with the participants along with the presentation. So I can send it to you after the webinar.
Yes, that sounds great.
We will send ours as well, of course.
Perfect. Then we will do a short, basically thank you email after the webinar, likely tomorrow, that you will receive, including the recording of the webinar, and then, as just mentioned by both speakers, with the 2 presentations, and maybe as well the brochure that Mrs. Bihari just mentioned. Okay, then let's start with the real questions. Mr. Kai Andreas Ressel had a question. I think that's a question for you, Dr. Scheil. He posted in German. I quickly translate. It's basically if products that are used for the production of drinking water fall under the food category under Vietnamese law.
No, production equipment or processing equipment for food products does not fall under food law. It's basically, there may be other technical standards for those products. I understand we are not talking about food containers, right? Because food containers are also regulated in some special food-related standards and regulations. But when it comes to processing equipment, that would fall outside of food law.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. If the question is more specific, Mr. Ressel, I'm sure that you now have the contact details of Dr. Scheil, and you can directly refer to him, and I'm sure that he will help you. Then there's another question in regard to ingredients from Mr. Gok Lung Chung, and he would like to know about the food label. I think you mentioned this in your presentation, Dr. Scheil, for food ingredients. How to do this if they are ingredient suppliers and not the direct product, but just the ingredients and the labeling for those.
Well, you don't have to list all ingredients of a that go into your food product on the label, but one thing is important, and I think you have similar regulations also in the EU or in China, for example. If you draw the special attention of consumers to certain ingredients, for example, through a certain name of the product, or adding certain pictures. Let's say you add pictures of fruits, for example, pineapple on the label. So then consumers, of course, expect to know, well, does this drink really include pineapple, contain pineapple? And then there may be stricter requirements to separately list a certain ingredient on a label. So it really depends on the overall presentation of the product and its packaging, which ingredients you have to list one by one.
Okay, thank you. And so far we have no questions for Ms. Bihari. So in this case, I would like to pose a question to her. If I'm interested to register my trademark in more than one of Southeast Asia's countries, is there a trademark, an international trademark registration platform available where I can find more than one application?
Yes, so actually this is a question we receive often from companies that, so what about if I register my trademark internationally? So there is not one single international registration available. However, there is the Madrid system, which is a centralized system for trademark registration. And the advantage of this system that you can file one single application for one set of fee, and it's available in 111 countries. And out of the 10 ASEAN countries, expect Myanmar, it's available. So through the Madrid system, you can register your trademark for more than one countries. However, we still recommend you to run a calculation because you need, so basically the registration, you will need to pay the fee also for the local registration in every country, but the admin fee is only one set of fee. So it's still better than if you go one by one.
Okay, understood. Thank you. And maybe to proceed with another question in this regard, if I want to make sure that no one registered my trademark in Vietnam, how can I check this information?
Yeah, so this is something that we also recommend to companies, that before they enter to a market, run a quick trademark search if anyone has registered their brand before. So there are different platforms where you can do it. So you can check it through the national data bank of the 10 ASEAN countries. The problem with that is that only for a few countries it's available in English. There is a ASEAN trademark view database where you can check it, or the EU IPO has a European Intellectual Property Right Office has a database, and WIPO has a global brand database where you can check it. These databases are, again, I would like to mention that not always up to date, but it's still worth checking it. And if any of the companies are interested to check it, they can also contact the IPR helpdesk and we can run the trademark search for them if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. That would have been my next question, but you answered it already. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's not surprising that not all the databases of the local countries are not available in English. But so far, your help is, I'm sure, much appreciated. Yeah, then I would come to the last question. That is for Dr. Scheil again. Mr. Benjamin Berada Razizadeh asked where they could do the registration of announcement to declare the conformity with food safety laws. Would you have an answer for that question, Dr. Scheil?
Yes, so generally the VFA, the Vietnam Food Administration, under the Ministry of Health, is the authority you should look for. A good starting point might be also to check their website, and you can send your application materials for registration by mail. You can visit the authority, and there is also an option to submit applications through the online public service system. If you have different locations, they may have offices in several cities or provinces. The office where your trader in Vietnam is located is the one which is competent.
Okay, thank you. And I think just when you ended, the clock was hitting the 11 Central European Standard Time. So I guess we have finished, answered all the questions that have come up. If you, dear participants, have other questions coming up after the webinar, please feel free to directly contact our two speakers. I'm sure that they are happy to help. Contact details will be included in the presentations that we will send to you tomorrow. And yeah, thank you, Dr. Scheil and Ms. Bihari, for your time and answering the questions, giving interesting presentations. I do think that the Vietnamese market is not only in the food sector, but in general very attractive at the moment. And we would be happy if some of you, dear participants, would follow us to Vietnam, where we also are going to meet the colleagues from the EU IPR SME Help Desk and also Dr. Scheil of Schulz-Nock-Berwinkel. So then other questions could be answered in person. Thank you too. If there's anything else you would like to add, please do now for our two speakers.
Well, just a brief thank you also from my side, and thank you also to Mr. Marek for your great organization and preparation. And it would be nice to see all of you in Vietnam then in November.
Same from my side. It was a pleasure to speak at the webinar, and we look forward to meeting the delegates in Vietnam. And in the meantime, there is any question, feel free to address it to the IPR Help Desk. Thank you for the organization, Mr. Marek. Okay,
then thank you. Back to the Asia Pacific, and we will do a small follow-up tomorrow. If there are any questions, you can directly refer to me or to our speakers. Okay, thank you all, and see you around. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.